One of the things I want to start with is naming where I am at in this process, given everything that I've heard. So I became aware when Marty was talking about a tremendous weight of grief that was just weighing me down. So I want to name that for you in case you are also feeling something similar. I think we would have to be stoned cold statuary to not feel grief and outrage and shock and horror at everything we've heard today. What I'm appreciating most about the day is that the different speakers have taken me on a journey in terms of my thoughts and my feelings from the systems level and the human rights level and the law enforcement level and the refugee struggles all through. And the piece that I am bringing to this conversation is the mental health perspective. I am going to take you inside what I call the black box and share with you my experience of working with the suffering, the psychological devastation that human trafficking and exploitation can create. Before I do that, I want to theoretically locate myself by letting you know that I am not an abolitionist. To be perfectly frank, I don't know what the right answers are in terms of policy and law and morality and all of these very challenging issues that different people in the audience are struggling with. I think what is important that we are struggling. That's the most important thing for me going on today. Because if we are struggling, it means we are showing up for the ball game. And victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, forced sexual exploitation, are the disappeared within our culture. We hear about the disappeared in other people's cultures, in El Salvador, in Central America, and South America. People know about that stuff. We don't acknowledge the women and the children and the men that are in the commercial sex industry in Canada, not by choice, not by free choice. Choice is an interesting concept. In order to have choice, you have to have options. If you don't have options for financial reasons or mental health reasons, then choice becomes a little bit problematic. When I am working on the Chrysalis line, I actually volunteer as a counselor on the line that I founded, so right now I'm covering about 5 shifts because I'm down volunteered, so I fill in all the gaps. So I talk to people in the sex industry across this country all the time. And many of them are planning to stay, and some of them are struggling with whether or not to get out. And what I say to them, I've been asked the question, should I get out of this business? And I have replied, I think you're asking the wrong question. I think the question is, if you're going to be in this business, is there a way to do it so that you are not psychologically and physically harmed? And if there isn't a way, then maybe we can have a conversation about what you feel you need to do at this point in your journey to get in or get out. So I support lots of people who are actively in the sex industry, and right now they're staying. It's all good. They have bad dates, and they call, and they debrief, and we do frontline trauma work because these are human beings. They are not statistics. They are people. And behind the policy and behind the theory are human beings that are in desperate agony. Desperate. And they are in shame, and they are lost. And the reason I founded the Chrysalis line is because in some of the sector of biggest trauma in the country, most of my colleagues don't work there. They don't work in this dirty little population where people, we are told in the old paradigm, it's their fault, it's their responsibility, they've put themselves in harm's way, therefore, having a bad date, which is also, frankly, let's be clear, a bad date is usually attempted murder. That's not what we call it, but that's what it is. They've put themselves in that situation, and so it's their fault. That doesn't interest me as a clinician. Whose fault? What fault? What I need to know is this person well or not well? What I do know as a clinician is that there are people in the sex industry who are well. So in terms of language, I would like to see some cleaning up I agree that there's conflation of prostitution and human trafficking, and I agree from a mental health perspective, because there is a huge difference between, psychologically, there's a huge difference between being in the sex industry, feeling empowered or semi-empowered, somewhat in control, and having resources to keep yourself safe, and at the end of the day you walk away not feeling violated. And the inverse, where you're not there by choice, or you were forced in for survival reasons, and you walk away feeling violated. So for example, one of the young men out of Toronto who calls our line regularly, he's still actively in the sex industry, and we have worked together for him to establish some clear boundaries around what kind of sex work is okay for him psychologically. So he's involved in BDSM scenarios as part of his work. It actually isn't very good for him because he has a history of being molested, incest. And so the BDSM professional work triggers unresolved psychological wounds from his incest history. Where he is not injured in the work is in stripping, in dancing, in working with couples, and working with individuals, because he has no trauma history in that area. So looking at where the person is at in their process as a clinician is the most important part for me of the conversation. And it's what I offer to you, because some of my very good friends are abolitionists. And I've said to them, if I were an abolitionist, that would mean that I would take my value system and impose it on my client, the person that I'm there to serve. And in my profession, that is highly unethical. What I wish for the people in this industry is all good things, in or out. What's important to me in terms of connecting with you guys is not your politics. Your politics doesn't really interest me, to be perfectly honest. What interests me is how authentic are you in this work, no matter where you stand in the circle. How authentic are you? Are you in it for your career? Are you here to make money? Are you here to get famous? Are you here to serve? So for me, this is a vocation. I just happen to get paid for doing it, but this is a vocation. Human rights is a vocation, is a calling for me. So wherever you are in the spectrum, if you're against or for, or you want to put people in hospital like I do, or you want to arrest them like some of my very dear friends do, what I want is people who are authentic and true and committed to engage me in conversation. I want to engage you, and I want to see you engage others, because I truly believe that the only solution, the only viable solution, is going to be an imperfect solution where none of us gets everything we want, but the solution will be rich and layered so that all the most important pieces are integrated into some coherent matrix. And that includes honoring the perspective of law enforcement, honoring the perspective of academia, honoring the perspective of mental health. Because we're really good at saying, like, our corner of the issue is the most important. That's bullshit. It's not true. The victim actually needs every single lens in the room. They need us to stop grandstanding and being in our corners and our pylons. They need us to find trusted allies, the coalition of the willing, if you will. They need us to seek each other out and continue this conversation and come up with a complex, rich, multi-layered plan for their well-being, which may include supporting their choice to stay in the sex industry. It could very well include that. So I want to throw that out to you as stuff to chew on as I tell you what it's like inside my world. I will start with my trauma tree. So I'm a visual learner, so the good thing about this presentation is it's all pictures. When I first decided to specialize in trauma, the research is so complex, and human trafficking is actually only one subset of a subset of trauma psychology, and I'm a trauma specialist, so I work across the board. Human trafficking is only one piece of what I do. But what's important about this image, and something that I'd like you to take away, is the idea that trauma is actually a source code or a root problem. So when you look at the tree, you can see things like dissociation, codependence, PTSD, depression, anxiety, all kinds of mental health issues, which we certainly find in the trafficking and exploitation population. I refer to this group, by the way, as HTX, which means human trafficking and exploitation, because the mental health issues on both sides are often similar. But what's important to notice is that there's 4 little boxes. You can't actually see them, but I'll read them to you. One is type 1 or acute experiential trauma. The other is chronic trauma, type 2, attachment trauma, and vicarious trauma. The most important thing is not actually the anxiety, the depression, the shame. That's the fruit of the tree. We can manage the symptom and never actually solve the problem. You can take people out of the sex industry. You can keep them safe. But if you are not able to help them rewire internally their worldview, their sense of values, their sense of self-esteem, all of those things, they very easily will remain vulnerable to predation. It is not unusual to have the same victim preyed upon over and over post-rescue through the human trafficking system. And you go, well, wow, this person was trafficked last year and we got her out, and then she was trafficked this year. I actually have a case story that's something that just happened in Edmonton a couple of months ago, which was exactly the case. 2 of them, actually, which I will tell you briefly about. So let me walk you through type 1 trauma. Type 1 trauma is a single incident assault, mugging, rape, beating, some kind of one-time hit that is going to fracture the vase and maybe break off some of the pieces, as you can see. So the vase is a metaphor for somebody's state of mind. It'll break it, but it will not annihilate it. This is not our victim of human trafficking. Our victim of human trafficking belongs in a different psychological category. They are type 2 trauma survivors. Type 2 trauma survivors are survivors of chronic, repetitive, intensive abuse and trauma, typically of an interpersonal nature. So human trafficking victims are in this box, POWs, refugees, survivors of domestic violence, children who are battered over and over and over. The rule is more is worse. So 20 hits is worse than 1, right? Pay attention to the fact that there is an image here of a vase that is intact. That's type 1. But in type 2, you will notice there is nothing intact. What that tells you is that the ego structure, or the sense of self of the client, is no longer present. It means that there's been a psychological collapse. Right? So if our victim has had a single incident, typically there's a sense of self that is coherent enough that they can actually advocate for resources. They might be able to call the police. They might be able to have enough internal sense of safety, perhaps even self-esteem, to try and reach out for help. There's all kinds of internal mechanisms that have to be activated in order for a victim to even reach out. Like literally pick up the phone. There's all kinds of internal things that need to occur, many of which are not present in populations that are repeatedly abused, victims of human trafficking being one of them. So this is one way of looking at the population that we are attempting to support. Victims of sexual exploitation / prostitution, so voluntary or involuntary, really depends on how they made their way into the business. Did they have a long-term history of abuse that led them there? Did they experience multiple bad dates and battery along the way? Quite probably. And so there's a very good chance that their inner landscape also looks like this slide. We have attachment trauma, which is the form of trauma in which the caregiver is the predator. So I've worked with people who were pimped out by their parents. It's actually not that uncommon, I'm sorry to tell you. People do get pimped out by their parents. You'll be horrified to know that 2 of the women that I've worked with were pimped out by their mothers. You gotta ask yourself, what mother would pimp out her own daughter? But in fact, it does happen. Vicarious trauma, this is us. This is us on the front line, looking at this repetitive car accident, never sure if we have the resources and the support and the need to fix anything, and the horror. And the reason it is so important for me to name my grief is because I plan to be here for the long haul. So this work is not going to take my soul. That I can promise you. And in order to ensure that I don't get completely sucked into the abyss, I have to remember that I am human in this work, and that the work will break my heart over and over and over again. I do a lot of work with cops. In my practice, I own a trauma center. I only do trauma. I have a life outside of trauma, but in terms of professional life, I only work in trauma, and a lot of my clients are police officers. Other of my clients are firefighters and paramedics and people on the front line who are being broken by the work that they are doing to rescue other people. That's vicarious trauma. So inside the black box, one of the things I'm doing right now, I'm trying to finish my dissertation, which hopefully I'll be done in about 4 months. Keep your fingers crossed. And when I'm done that, the next piece of work that I plan to do is around studying traumatic bonding in victims of human trafficking in relation to their offender, to the pimp or the trafficker, depending on how the scenario works out. Because I'm very interested in understanding what the psychological mechanisms are that keep people mentally trapped. So you were saying it's a mind game. It absolutely is. You can actually tie somebody up in their brain. You don't have to tie their body. You just have to trap them in a psychological net, and they will stay forever. You can beat them and beat them and beat them, and they won't walk out. There's all kinds of reasons for that. So right now, the 4 models that I'm playing with, which need to be studied, but I'm in the early conceptual phases, are the mature personality, immature personality, traumatized personality, and collectivist personality. And these are sort of rough and ready descriptors for the groups that I've heard from police officers and other allies of mine in the human trafficking movement, what they're seeing in terms of victim type. So the mature personality refers to somebody who has a very strong sense of boundaries and a sense of self. So they're confident, they're strong, they know who they are. That group tends to not make a very good victim. It is true that offenders know who to choose. There's a reason they're hanging out outside group homes, right? Because they've already separated out a subpopulation of vulnerable people. There's a reason they prey on refugees and not multimillionaires' children going to very expensive universities. Resourcing is an issue. So typically, the mature personality is not someone I would expect to see become a victim of human trafficking, although nothing is impossible. Nothing is impossible. The immature personality is something that we're seeing a little bit more of when we're talking about youth trafficking youth, or youth getting into the industry, or young people who don't seem to have some crazy trauma history, but somehow they've been lured in anyway. And I just recently was informed, I don't know if anybody's heard of it, of who knows about sugar babies? Like about 5 people in the audience. So I thought I'd seen it all until some of my buddies in the Vice unit in Edmonton sent me an interview that they had done for the media, where they were talking about the sugar babies we have in Edmonton, which are young people who are renting out their time to the tune of $2,000 to $5,000 a month. Renting out their time to sugar mamas and sugar papas. And you can actually go to a website and sign up to be a sugar baby. And it's kind of like a dating site, but not really. And what is said is that sex is not being sold. We don't know what's being sold. We're told time is being sold. And there are sugar mamas and sugar papas who will pay up to $5,000 a month to these young people for their companionship. And a ton of them are students at the University of Alberta, studying to get degrees, presumably coming from somewhat resourced backgrounds. Otherwise, how could they be paying the tuition? And here they are in these really potentially risky scenarios and relationships that could potentially at some point lead them into the trafficking world. We don't know. But interesting that it's not just abuse history that'll make you vulnerable to human trafficking. So we have to wait and see what's going on in this new sugar baby movement. The population that I am most familiar with, because I'm a trauma psychologist, is the traumatized personality. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So this is the individual that has no boundaries and no sense of self. So the reason that I have the slide set up this way is the little green ball represents a sense of self, And then the outer white bubble represents my boundary, the way that I separate me from you. So you're over there and I'm over here and we're separate people and I have rights and you have rights. And so as human beings, we negotiate those rights. So notice that the mature personality has a really nice solid ball and a really strong white line, which says they have really healthy boundaries. They don't tolerate people hitting them, they don't tolerate people using them or defiling them or degrading them in any way. That's a no-no, that's a deal breaker. The immature personality does have a nascent sense of self, but their boundaries are kind of wobbly, which means that they're open to manipulation. They might be manipulated through toys and purses and loot and flashy cars. They might be manipulated through love. I love you, therefore. And there's the classic story of the human trafficking groomer who pretends to be your boyfriend and is really nice to you and then comes and tells you a story about how some bad guys are about to beat him up and you love me, baby, I need your help, and if you could only just sort of do this one thing, which is just go dance for a couple of nights at this club that my friend owns, and then one thing leads to another. That's a grooming protocol. It's very effective in this population of young people because their boundaries are not strong enough to hold against the lure or the coercion. In the traumatized personality, you will notice there is no green bubble. What does that tell you? Yell it out. Yes? Can you say that loudly? Yes, absolutely. If there's no green bubble, there's a very good chance they're a type 2 trauma survivor. And if the green bubble isn't present, it means a sense of self is typically not present. So as a trauma psychologist, when I open the door to somebody's mind, which I do every day for hours a day, when I open the door to somebody's mind, there is an inner universe, as we all know, because we're all people too, which is as large as the universe outside. It's vast in there. And at some point, I want to, as a clinician, arrive at a center. So I tend to think of it like a bicycle wheel. There's got to be a hub, and then there's, aspects of your identity. I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a mom, I'm whatever. But before I am Jacqui, I'm a scholar, I'm a student, I'm a teacher, I just am. I am in the universe. I exist. Before I am named publicly, I exist privately. In the traumatized population, that sense of I amness often is not present. So I will say to my clients, who are you? And they will tell me, I do not know. That tells me that the hub of the bicycle wheel is actually cracked or is absent, which is a big problem, because guess what moves in there? Addiction, mental health issues, manipulation, love as a form of heroin, all of this kind of stuff, money, fur coats, cars, put anything you want in there. Nature abhors a vacuum, including a psychological vacuum. And so you will see survivors who come out of the traumatized personality segment stuff all kinds of things into that hole in their soul. My doctoral dissertation, which is taking forever, is actually, the reason it's taking forever is it's really complex, because I'm studying soul loss in survivors of child sexual abuse. Do you have any idea how many layers I have to peel back to get to soul loss? It's a long journey, but a vital one, because it's a piece that often isn't in the conversation in terms of exploitation, women who stay with men who batter, all of this kind of stuff. Who arrived in the relationship in the first place? Was there anybody there? Was there a coherent, strong, vibrant, healthy self to engage this moment, yes or no? Very often the answer is no. The other people who can look like this traumatized personality are refugees who come from extreme poverty where survival, not self, is the name of the game. You got to keep the body alive before you can have a philosophical conversation about feelings and thoughts and opinions. And you pipe that person through a brutal system where they are treated like chattel. It's not just the traffickers who treat refugees like chattel. Our system, the system that we fund and we pay for, treat them as chattel. There are file numbers. They are not people. Let us be clear. And so what can happen is if there is a sense of self at all, it can be completely crushed under the chronic long-term stress. And so whatever self was there It's sort of, some of them make it and some of them don't, and you never know. You never know who is going to survive psychologically. People can walk around in bodies, totally ambulatory, they can pay mortgages, and they can put their children to school, and they can even have careers, because this is half my caseload, and have nobody home inside. One of my best stories is about a client of mine who's actually doing really well right now, but when he first came into my practice, he was hanging from his basement rafters, and the police had to cut him down. I had met him once before because he had hired me to do consulting for an organization he was running. That was before he was hanging from the rafters. And I spent a full year, soldier, decorated military officer. I spent a full year going toe-to-toe with him, negotiating whether or not he was going to kill himself. At one point, I actually had to drive over to his house, and he's much bigger than I am. And I said, come with me. And he said, what, what are you doing here? And I said, well, here's the thing. You are now out of options. You will get into my car, and I will drive you to the hospital. You will get into your car, and I will follow you to the hospital, or the police will come and take you to the hospital. It is no longer your decision. And that is because, and this is the question I was asking Annalie earlier, if there's no green bubble, there's nothing left to make the choice. So somebody's got to be the grown-up in the scenario, and that is why I am licensed. That's why I'm highly trained and I'm licensed, because I had to make that call for him. And he actually survived 3 suicide attempts, and he's doing really well. He's actually back in university now, which is great. The collectivist personality is kind of an interesting one. This is my thoughts, and these are all very preliminary, but these are my thoughts around people who come from collectivist cultures like Thailand, like Asia, like Bangladesh, where being a good woman, it is understood that you are also obedient. So the values around self and other are very different than they are in North America. So there's a much more expanded sense of self. The boundaries are much more porous. This is true in our Aboriginal population. In Canada, Aboriginal people are collectivist people. So their sense of self is a plural self. It is not a singular self. And one of the risks there is their sense of self is vastly expanded, and so sometimes, if you know what you're doing, it might be a little bit easier to get through the boundary wall and manipulate this person. Nobody shows up, I'm really warm and really fuzzy, but don't ever show up at my house without phoning first. But I have clients who have relatives who just wander in and help, they're Aboriginal clients. They wander in, they borrow their stuff, they wander out, they don't even leave a note. And I'm going, oh, I would hate that. But for a collectivist person, this is totally appropriate and it's totally healthy. So we have to build that into the equation in terms of what does injury look like and what does violation look like. Violation of the self is very different for somebody coming from an individualistic culture as opposed to a collective one. The variables that come up in terms of human trafficking survivors, the personality profile, the mature, the immature, the traumatized, or diffuse. When you're working with a victim of human trafficking, who are you working with? Because these 4 bubbles are operating systems. This is like Windows Vista, Windows XP, Windows 8, and Mac, Mac OS 10. They're not the same machine. So it is not true that the same intervention is going to be effective for all 4 populations. That is not true. That's why we're having such a hard time getting it right, because what worked with the last victim ain't going to work with the next one, because it ain't the same computer. That's a given. Something to think about, which was touched on a few times today, was the mental health component. So there's a huge undiagnosed mental health calamity going on in this human trafficking exploitation population. Now this is typically, I would separate out, and going forward, I just want to make it clear, I don't place women or men who feel that they have entered the sex industry voluntarily. They feel empowered in the work, they feel safe in the work, and they have resources available. I would not put them in this category. So I want us, so I don't have to keep making the point, I want us to bracket them, because they're not the same psychologically. And quite frankly, those are the people I would call and say, do me a favor and keep an eye out for anybody you think is being trafficked. Let me know who's coming into your massage parlor or something. And one of my colleagues, Danielle Strickland, does this. She actually works with lots of people in the sex industry who are staying. And, whatever your label, pimp, madam, and she will negotiate with them, keep an eye out. And I'll tell you what, she gets phone calls from the owners of massage parlors saying, there's a woman who's working for me and something's not right, and I want you to come and interview her. So I absolutely agree with the sentiment that one of the most important allies that we need to bring to the table are the people who are in the business, because they have access to the back rooms and the basements. They know what to look for in terms of somebody who is there voluntarily and somebody who's there who isn't there voluntarily. And the people that we need to support are the ones who don't want to be there. I have no issue with people who are in voluntary prostitution, choose to stay, feel safe and well doing it. So PTSD, dissociation, depression, and addiction are commonly found in populations where the sex work is involuntary, because sex in all forms is the ultimate penetration of the self. Once you cross the orifice of the mouth, the vagina, or the anus, you have entered inside the organism. This is one of the reasons that rape is considered the worst form of trauma across the board, bar none, and it is the form of psychological trauma or trauma exposure most likely to result in PTSD. Unreal, like the numbers are double or something, right through the roof. Because the body, in that particular case, is the scene of the crime and will remain so. For somebody who is voluntarily in the sex industry, the body is not the scene of the crime, and therefore the secondary psychological meltdown doesn't necessarily occur. So in this population, one of the questions is, the woman is with the guy and he's beating her, and he goes out and she's by herself seeing 6 or 7 or 8 clients. She's alone for 12 hours a day. Why doesn't she run? Well, I'm here to tell you there's a very good chance she does not have the psychological wherewithal to do so, possibly because of the presence of PTSD, dissociation, depression, addiction, or whatever. This is just some of the most basic diagnostic criteria that I've seen in people who are in this population. Self-esteem is another interesting one. Is it high or is it low? Locus of control. We'll talk about learned helplessness, preferred coping strategies, and innate resilience, their ability to bounce back. All of these things are factors that are going to come up when you're working on the front lines with victims of human trafficking and exploitation. So here's my little sort of drill down into the traumatized personality. For time, I had to park the other 3 and even notice. So here's a prejudice of mine. It's really hard to find, for me, as somebody who runs the Chrysalis crisis line, I get calls from all over Canada from people who are in the sex industry because I advertise our phone number on Backpage. So everybody else is selling sex and I'm selling healing on the same site and paying the same rates for it. It's really expensive to advertise on Backpage. So I get calls from people who are in the sex industry. I've never in the 2 years I've run the line gotten a call from a victim of labor trafficking. Never. Not only don't they self-identify, I don't even know where to find them. I know people who have talked about cases, but I don't know where they are to give out my number to get them to call me to debrief. So part of my closed lines, and it was great to have people like Lolly talking about the labor side, because I live in this world where sex trafficking is what I see day in and day out. And so I failed to develop a model for a psychological profile of a victim of labor trafficking. And that only came to my attention when I was doing some training in Ottawa at the police college, and Mary-Claude Arsenault said, well, Jacqui, is this the same for men who have been trafficked or women who have been trafficked? And I said, no, actually not at all. If it's a man who's been trafficked, it's a whole other profile, because there's stuff there around shame and masculinity and the inability to feed your children and protect your woman that are deeply embedded, not just in the male psyche in general, but it's even more so in certain cultures, that have to be factored in terms of what's going on in the operating system. And the reason I need to come to these conferences and listen to all you guys is so that I can open up my own biases in terms of my own thinking in this work. And the only way for me to do that, the only way for me to grow and learn, is for you to track my blind spots and give me feedback. The best piece of feedback I actually ever got was from one of Robin's people out in BC. I was starting a conversation about, because I just want to put everybody in hospital. Let's put everybody in hospital and keep them safe. And it was actually one of the Octip people who said, let's talk about human rights. And Victor said to me, human rights is not a theory. It is an actual thing. It's not a philosophical conversation. It is not academic. It's in the world. And you have to operate like it's in the world. That was a huge wake-up call for me. Because I'm thinking of it much more in a conceptual sense, not in a boots-on-the-ground sense. I'm all about let's save the life and then negotiate everything else, right? And there's validity to that, but it's not the whole picture. And the perspectives that all of you bring, the pimps have to go to jail and all this, there's validity to that, but I work with offenders. I have, in my practice, I used to work in a men's prison. Who asks the question, how did the guy arrive at a place in his development where he had so little empathy that he could sell a human being? What the hell happened to him? Let me tell you something. The worst traumatized population I've ever seen is a bunch of men that I treated when I was working in a prison. The things they had survived, I actually won't speak about now because they're just too horrific. But things happen to people, male and female, along the way. And for me, on both sides, the demand and the survivor side, or the delivery, or whatever language you want to use, I'm talking about a mental health issue. It's not the only issue, but mental health issues are going on both sides. No sense of self is where we start the conversation from the survivor's perspective. I wonder if the perpetrator has a sense of self either. I don't know. I wonder. Enmeshment is the next piece. So here we have a psychological organism, an operating system, if you will, where there's no cohesion at the core, and the boundaries are perforated. So the system, if you want to think about it in sort of an image, the system is unstable. It's like missing another leg or something. Right? There's pieces missing in this organism. So what am I going to do? I'm going to find some equally unhealthy person who's configured with some of the same injuries that I am. And your wounds and my wounds are going to come together, and we're going to make this beautiful, toxic, magical relationship that we see in partners who use violence, verbal and physical. We see it between adults and their children. We see it between the so-called prostitute and her pimp. We see it between the human trafficker and her handler, right? Why is it that these psychological systems are hemorrhaging into one another and they can't extract? It's like two root systems on a tree that are so interwoven that if any of you, God forbid the cops show up, but if any of us show up and say, let me take you out of here and take you to safety, there's a good chance they're going to say no. Why would they say no? Because the psychological field of the victim is often so deeply interwoven in the psychological field of the offender or the perpetrator or the trafficker that to tear them apart is actually going to cause additional mental health issues for both sides, because it's like amputating a limb without anesthetic. We are not welcome. You'll notice anybody here who works with domestic violence, the cops show up, the social worker shows up, any of these so-called helpers show up, they don't want you in there. Why is that? Because as outsiders, we do not understand the complexity of the psychological interweaving between a victim and a perpetrator. And that's actually, over the next few years, that's the work. That's the thing I want to study. What is that? And what is the safest way to dismantle it? Because to rip it apart, much like a plant, if you have a favorite plant that you're trying to repot, if you rip it apart and you tear out half the root system, there's a 50-50 chance the plant is going to make it when you repot it in some other sunny place. And it's because half the root system has been torn off. And in our population, half the psychological root system is actually with the offender. Mental health, PTSD, dissociation, depression, addiction. We see this over and over. One of the things that I notice working in this population is that in that empty space where I want to see this ball of light called empowerment, often what I find is deep shame. And when a person comes from a place of deep shame, it's actually not that hard to manipulate them psychologically. And the shame is true in the sex trafficking case. It is also true for the labor trafficking case, particularly with men, where the shame is that they have failed as men to do what men are supposed to do, which is provide for their families. Locus of control is a sense of empowerment, and what we want in a healthy organism is to have the client, the survivor, the victim, whatever language you choose to use, we want them to feel empowered. But typically, if they've made their way through the refugee system, if they are in the domestic case, very often domestic trafficking victims are survivors of incest, childhood sexual abuse, all kinds of traumas, the locus of control, or the sense of empowerment over their life, was ripped out of them a long time ago. So it's just not that hard for another person to come and take this ball of light. So rather than having the ball of light in your own tummy, it's in somebody else's hands, like on the right slide. And so all the trafficker has to do is just come and scoop it up by offering you something, some kind of lure, and then they control you. And that's why the control is actually a mind thing, not a body thing. You remain in a situation where you're being controlled long enough and learned helplessness sets in. And pretty soon, it's not that you couldn't get out, it's that you can't even think about getting out. This is the psychological state that victims arrive at when they've tried to exit, they've negotiated an exit, they're told they have to pay 100 grand. I mean, all of that's just beyond, right? Somebody's hanging you over the side of a balcony. You learn pretty quick, don't rock the boat or you're gonna die. So what they do is they use appeasement to reduce the risk of threat. And appeasement is one of 6 mammalian defense strategies. It is actually the 5th strategy that's deployed when avoidance, running for your life, fighting for your life are not on the table as options. So the best thing that a small, frail woman can do in the presence of a large predator, male or female, is appease them, because her likelihood of surviving the encounter increases, because the more she appeases, the calmer the offender becomes, right? So he may beat her, but he might not kill her. You have to trade off when your life is on the line. In terms of the process of appeasement, disturbed social relation where she rocks the boat by calling the police. Then he tells her he's going to kill her. And then she says, oh my God, the police can't protect me, so I better start looking submissive and giving him everything he wanted. And one step up from submissive is affiliative. Not only am I going to obey you, I'm going to be really, really nice to you and send all kinds of signals that I care about you. And then maybe you'll only beat me, but you won't murder me, and I will live to possibly fight another day. The reconciliation process reduces the risk of aggression, thereby increasing her likelihood of survival. And we make across the board on the front line the mistake of thinking if she goes back to him, it's because she's a non-compliant witness, and that's often not the case. Often it's the case that she has assessed that the police do not have the resources to protect her, or her family, or her mother in Hungary, or whatever, and therefore she has to negotiate a deal for herself, and the best way to do that is to go back to the trafficker. You will find that victims, some of them use approach coping and some of them use avoidant. So if they are running an approach coping strategy, they might come to police and reach out, but many personalities just avoid hard stuff. And if they're wired that way, there's a very good chance they're never going to pick up the phone and call you and get the help that's on the table. Resilience is it's kind of like a bingo game. You just sort of roll the dice and see what happens. Some people who are trauma survivors have high resilience, meaning that they just shake it off and they move on. Others are fast recoverers, meaning that they bounce back really quickly even though they take a hit. The slow recoverers may take months to years to come back, and then the no recoverers are the people who don't make it. Either psychologically they're lost or physically they're lost. And there's no way for us to know ahead of time which of the resilience patterns the victim or the survivor or the person will be expressing. Stockholm Syndrome is something I'm thinking about a lot right now because there's a lot of similarities between what's called Stockholm Syndrome and traumatic bonding and the stuff that we see going on between a human trafficking victim and their trafficker, or an exploited woman and her pimp. The threat is present, the isolation is present, the perceived inescapability is present, and kindness. It is not true that he's beating her every day. Usually he's just beating her most days. So sometimes he's actually being really nice to her. And you introduce that element of kindness from a threatening figure, and that seems to increase the bonding that occurs between victim and perpetrator. And then on the outside, we have no way to get inside that closed circuit. It's a closed circuit, and we, the helpers, are perceived as the threat, not the helper, because we threaten the system, because we want to dismantle it. So when we're talking about victims of human trafficking and forced exploitation, psychologically, often they're fragile, they are brittle landscapes. And so the most important thing I can offer you as a therapist who works in this population and who's done a lot of reading, a lot of study, is to handle them with care. And the best way to handle them with care is for us as the professionals to negotiate the solutions ahead of time and work it out so that we have these gap-free solutions so that these precious, precious butterflies don't get squashed in the gaps in our ideologies and our agendas and whatever else we have going on between our various agencies. At the end of the day, a human being in all the history of the world will never come again. There is only one. Victim X, victim Y, victim Z, we call them numbers, but it's kind of like snowflakes. There's a lot of them out there, right? But if you look at them under a microscope, the crystals are different. They're unique. They're like thumbprints. So to lose one is to lose all in some sense. And I think we have to do better on the front lines in terms of leveraging all the expertise, maybe parking our politics a little bit more than we do, our funding, grants, and all the proposals, all the other stuff that gets in the way of the work, and remembering at the end of the day, this is all we have. And if we don't support these people, if we don't get to what Rumi calls the place beyond wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. And we will sit down and we will have a conversation. And hopefully, we are going to be able to save some of these very precious people. Thank you very much.